Sir, economy passengers do not touch first-class seat. Stake your family and move to the back before I call security. The male flight attendant snapped so loudly that conversations stopped row by row. And for one humiliating second, the entire front cabin turned to stare at the father, standing in the aisle with a worn duffel bag in one hand and his little girl's inhaler pouch in the other. His wife beside him in a faded sweater still holding their son's wrist. Both children frozen under the weight of strangers' eyes, while the steward's smile stayed on his face in that cruel, polished way people use when they want to sound professional while cutting someone down in public. And when the father calmly lifted the boarding passes and said, "These are our seats," the man didn't even glance at them before answering. Then someone made a mistake, as if poor people could only exist in first class by accident. And a young passenger across the aisle had already raised her phone, recording the moment because something in the father's silence made the insult feel uglier than a shouting match ever could. While an older woman in 2A slowly lowered the magazine in her lap and watched with narrowed eyes. Sensing the shift no one else had words for yet, because humiliation like this has a sound. It lives in the pause after laughter dies and before courage speaks. And if you're here with EchoStory, stay with this one, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do if you saw a family treated like this in public, because what they didn't know, what no one expected, was that within minutes the same steward who mocked their clothes, doubted their tickets, and tried to throw them off the aircraft would stand speechless in front of a cabin no longer belonging to the airline at all, while the family he tried to bury in shame quietly bought every first-class seat in sight, and turned a moment of cruelty into something the whole airport would never forget. 2 hours earlier, Terminal C had been glowing with that cold airport light that makes everyone look more tired than they already are. Blue-white reflections sliding across polished floors, announcements echoing under steel beams, coffee carts steaming in the distance, rolling suitcases clicking like clocks in every direction. And through all of it walked the family nobody noticed for the right reasons, because they didn't look like the people travel ads are written for. They looked like people who had been through something. The father in clean but inexpensive jeans, dark jacket, and work boots that had seen years of wear. The mother carrying a reusable grocery tote instead of designer luggage. The boy with a paperback book tucked under one arm, and the little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear sewn back on by hand, while strangers moved around them with the small automatic arrogance of people who think appearance is evidence. But if anyone had looked closely, really looked, they would have noticed the father's posture, not timid, not lost, just contained. A man whose calm had been built somewhere pain could not reach easily anymore. He kept checking the time on an old watch with a scratched face, not because he was anxious about status or comfort, but because the family had come straight from a hospital 3 states away, where his younger sister's son had survived a surgery no one was sure he would survive, and they were finally headed home after 6 sleepless days, moving through the terminal with that special kind of exhaustion that strips people down to what matters. Children fed, medicine packed, boarding gate found, no drama, no mistakes. Just get home. And every few steps, the mother glanced at him with a look that said the same thing she had been saying without words for years. Don't spend more than we have. Don't apologize for what we do have. Keep walking. While overhead the departure board flickered and reloaded, and somewhere deeper inside the terminal a private conversation was already beginning that would change what this day meant for all of them, though from the outside they still looked exactly like the sort of family powerful people rarely see until they are in the way. At the check-in kiosk, the first small crack in the day had already shown itself when the machine rejected their reservation twice, and the father didn't slam the screen or curse under his breath the way the businessman behind him expected him to. He simply tried once more, then stepped aside and led the family to the service desk, where a young airline employee with tired eyes and a name tag reading Lena greeted them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled many irritated travelers already that morning. But the moment she pulled up the booking, her expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for the father to notice because the reservation had been modified less than 30 minutes before. 3 economy seats moved to first class and 1 blocked companion seat opened beside them, all paid in full by an external transaction. And when she looked up to confirm the names, the father's face stayed unreadable, though a flicker passed through his eyes like he had expected something unusual, but not this. While the mother leaned closer and whispered, "There has to be a mistake," and Lena lowered her voice, glancing once over her shoulder before saying, "I can only tell you what's on the screen. Sir, these are valid seats." Then printed the boarding passes with careful hands as though the paper itself had become important. Behind them, the businessman sighed dramatically, muttering something about people gaming the system. And the father ignored him, thanked Lena softly, and took the passes without triumph, without performance, as if comfort was not something he believed needed an audience, while Lena watched them go with a feeling she could not explain. Because airline employees learned to read travelers' fast honeymoons, funerals, first flights, business status, hidden panic, fake confidence, and there was something about this family that didn't fit the usual boxes, especially the father, whose calm seemed too practiced to come from luck. And as he guided his children toward security, phone buzzing once in his pocket and going unanswered, Lena found herself wondering who upgrades a family like that in total silence and why. Security took longer than expected because the little girl's medication bag triggered a manual check, and the officer opening it did so with the blunt impatience of a man already behind schedule, though the father answered every question with quiet precision, naming each inhaler, each sealed packet, each doctor's note, while the mother crouched to keep the child from crying and the boy stood still with his backpack hanging loose from one shoulder, watching adults move like gates around him. And when a woman in line behind them muttered, "If they knew they were flying, they should have packed better," the father heard it. Everyone did, but he chose silence. The kind that is not surrender but discipline. And for a brief second the scene tugged loose a memory from years earlier. A colder room, cheaper chairs, a landlord tapping a folder against his palm while saying, "People like you always promise rent by Friday," and the same father, younger then, thinner, with cracked hands and pride he couldn't afford, holding back anger because his wife was pregnant and dignity, was the only thing left in the apartment that could not be repossessed. The memory flashed and vanished as the TSA officer zipped the medication bag shut and shoved it back across the table. And still the father simply thanked him, gathered the children, and moved on, because he had learned long ago that reacting to small people often costs more than enduring them. While above the checkpoint televisions rolled muted news footage, no one was really watching. And in his jacket pocket that phone buzzed again, this time longer. The screen lighting up with a private number he let ring out once more, not because he wasn't curious, but because in that moment his daughter's breathing mattered more than any call in the world. By the time they reached the gate, the crowd had already begun sorting itself into the usual invisible hierarchy of modern travel: premium before priority, priority before families, families before the leftovers, everyone pretending the order was practical when it was really emotional, and the family took 4 seats near the window, sharing crackers from a travel tin while planes pushed off from neighboring gates under a morning sky washed silver by thin clouds. And there, with engines moving in silence behind glass, the father finally checked his phone and listened to a voicemail that changed the light in his face without changing his posture at all. The acquisition papers had cleared. The holdback had been released. The wire had landed. And a voice from New York was saying, almost laughing, "Daniel, it's done. You're liquid now. Call me back. And for once, please pick up." But when his wife looked up and asked, "Bad news?" he only slid the phone away and answered, "Not today," because the truth was too large, too recent, too unreal to speak over airport crackers and a child's rabbit toy. 7 years earlier he had started a quiet logistics software company from a storage unit after being laid off from a shipping dock, building route systems for small regional carriers no major firm cared about, taking contracts others thought were beneath them, missing birthdays, pawning tools, sleeping in the office during winter, while his wife worked double shifts and never once called his dream foolish. And now that company had just been acquired by a global freight network for more money than either of them had ever seen written next to their own names. But Daniel's first instinct was not celebration, it was caution, as if sudden wealth might vanish if spoken too loudly. So he kept the news folded inside himself and turned to help his daughter with her juice box, while just beyond them, by the podium, a tall male flight attendant with flawless hair, pressed uniform lines, and the easy contempt of a man who loved small authority more than service was already scanning the waiting area, making private judgments with every glance. His name tag read Brent, and he moved through the gate area like someone convinced the airline had entrusted him not with customer care but with social order, eyes landing longest on whoever looked like they might disrupt the version of elegance he believed he was curating. And when boarding began for first class, Daniel waited until the crowd thinned enough to avoid bumping anyone, gathered the children, and approached the line with those freshly printed passes in hand. But Brent's smile appeared before the scanner beeped and died the moment he really saw them. The cheap tote, the worn jacket, the inhaler pouch, the tired children, and in that single glance his decision was already made. He scanned the first pass, frowned theatrically, scanned the second, then held the third in the air a second too long and said, not quietly, "Sir, these seats are in the front cabin," and a few people nearby smirked as if they had been invited into a joke. While Daniel answered, "I'm aware," neither embarrassed nor confrontational, and Brent leaned in closer with that soft, poisonous tone used by people who want cruelty to sound like procedure. "Then perhaps you walked into the wrong boarding lane." But the scanner had already flashed green all 3 times, and Daniel could see it. Lena, who had come down from the desk to assist boarding, could see it from 10 feet away, and the older woman near the front of the line could see it too. Yet Brent still turned his body slightly so the line behind them could hear and said, "Let's step aside and sort this out without holding up actual first-class passengers." And that was the first public cut. The first clean moment where doubt became deliberate shame, while Daniel's son lowered his eyes to the floor and his daughter clutched the rabbit tighter, and Lena took one step forward before stopping herself because airline culture trains lower employees exactly when not to contradict the wrong superior in public. In the narrow glass jet bridge, with the plane door just ahead and the smell of fuel faintly hanging in recycled air, Brent stopped them again. This time more openly hostile because they were out of sight of the podium staff and closer to what he considered his space, and he lifted Daniel's boarding passes as if they might stain his hand, saying, "I'm going to ask this once, did someone give these to you?" While behind them passengers bunched up, forced to pause, turning annoyance toward the family because Brent had framed them as the obstacle. And the mother quietly said, "Please, our children are tired." But Brent ignored her and addressed Daniel only. "The way insecure men challenge other men when women and children are present, you can either tell the truth now, or we can make this a security issue." And a flush of heat climbed the jet bridge as strangers began forming opinions with no evidence at all. One woman whispering, "I knew it," another man shrugging like he had seen this type before, while the young passenger in a denim jacket near the wall lifted her phone and started recording in plain sight, no longer pretending to text because the scene had crossed some invisible moral line. Daniel looked at Brent for a long second and said, "Scan them again," not loud, not pleading, simply factual. But Brent laughed under his breath and answered, "The system isn't the issue here," which was the second cut policy no longer misread. But Miss Dan, in that moment, the older woman from elegant and silver-haired, stepped closer and said, "Young man, if the passes are valid." "This is disgraceful," her tone calm but edged with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Yet Brent gave her the smile reserved for elderly objections and replied, "Ma'am, I'm protecting the integrity of the cabin," and the sentence landed so offensively that even the passengers who had been neutral began shifting uncomfortably. Because once cruelty is named as integrity, everybody in earshot has to decide what kind of person they are. Brent led them onto the aircraft at last, but not to seat them, only to expose them more fully, marching them into the first-class aisle under warm, Gold cabin lights while people were still settling in, stowing bags, fastening blazers, and checking laptops. Then stopping beside row 3 and announcing, "There appears to be a discrepancy with these passengers' boarding documents," as if he were unveiling evidence rather than humiliating a family in front of 40 strangers. And Daniel felt his son inch closer to his side, felt his daughter retreat behind her mother's coat, but still he did not raise his voice. Because this was not the first room in which he had been treated like a problem before anyone knew his name. Years earlier, in the early days of his company, he had once pitched software at a regional freight conference and been mistaken for hotel staff twice before his meeting even began. Then laughed out of the room by men in polished shoes when he said routing errors were costing them millions, only for those same men to call him back 6 months later after his system saved a struggling carrier from collapse. And the lesson from that day had followed him into every insult since. Let people reveal themselves fully before you reveal anything at all. Meanwhile, Brent pointed toward the rear curtain and said, "Until this is resolved, I need you to wait in economy." And when Daniel answered, "No," just once, soft and steady, the whole front cabin seemed to inhale. Because refusal is shocking when it comes without aggression. And that was when the phone camera caught the father's face clearly for the first time, not angry, not ashamed, just still, and the older woman across the aisle removed her glasses, set them in her lap, and watched Brent the way judges watch liars. Lena boarded from the galley entrance carrying manifests and saw the scene already spiraling. Brent center stage, passengers whispering, the family standing in the aisle as though they had been put there for inspection, and her stomach dropped because she knew those seats were valid. She had personally reissued the passes, and yet the whole environment had already tilted in Brent's favor simply because he was louder and more certain. So she approached carefully and said, "Brent, I checked that reservation at the desk," hoping he would hear the warning in her tone and back down without making her challenge him directly. But he barely turned, replying, "Then you missed something." And the contempt in his voice hit her almost as hard as it hit Daniel. Because there are few moments more revealing than watching a person degrade. Not just the powerless, but also anyone standing near them without enough rank to matter. Lena looked at the screen on his handheld scanner, saw the green indicators, the seat assignments, the payment code, and felt a cold pressure behind her ribs, because at that point this was no longer a misunderstanding, it was a choice. An ugly one, and she became the insider the story needed without wanting the role, caught between policy and conscience while a small audience waited to see whether she would protect a coworker or the truth. Behind her, the captain's welcome announcement began playing overhead in a smooth recorded voice about comfort and safety, and the contrast was so surreal it made the scene feel staged, as if the plane itself were lying, while Daniel's wife gently knelt to zip their daughter's coat against the cabin chill, more focused on keeping the child calm than defending herself. A detail the older woman in 2A noticed and never forgot. Brent escalated because bullies almost always do when someone calm refuses to feed them. And with the finality of a man performing for an audience, he stepped back, tapped his phone, and said, "Security to aircraft door," turning a private error into a public accusation in one sharp breath, while a murmur rolled through the cabin. Heads angled into aisles, necks stretched, assumptions hardening instantly now that the word security had entered the air, and the man in 1D muttered, "There it is," like he had predicted dishonesty all along. Though he knew nothing, while Daniel's son finally spoke, voice low and fragile, "Dad, did we do something wrong?" And that single question cut deeper than Brent's performance ever could. Because children do not just hear humiliation, they absorb it like weather. And Daniel crouched so his eyes met the boy's and answered, "No, you stand where your ticket says you stand." Simple words. Almost quiet enough to be missed, but the woman recording caught them clearly. And later they would be the line that spread everywhere because truth spoken calmly often travels farther than outrage screamed in public. Then, before anyone could reframe the moment, Daniel stood again and asked Brent, "What is your employee ID?" Not threateningly, not with the grin of revenge, just measured. And Brent smiled as if the question amused him, as if poor men collecting names were part of the same old powerless ritual. "You can ask customer service after you step off my aircraft," he said, putting heavy possession on the word my. And that was the third cut authority curdled into ownership, while at the open aircraft door 2 airport officers appeared, broad-shouldered and already impatient, carrying the energy of men summoned for nonsense but ready to use force if embarrassment demanded it. The officers did what officers often do in public disputes when one side wears a uniform and the other does not. They looked first at the family, not the facts, and one of them said, "What seems to be the issue here?" with his body angled toward Brent like the answer was already halfway trusted. While Brent launched into a clean, professional summary stripped of its cruelty, questionable boarding credentials, refusal to comply with crew instruction, disruption of premium boarding, all the right words arranged to hide a wrong act. And the father listened without interruption, his left hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder as the little girl pressed her face into her mother's hip, inhaler pouch dangling from 2 fingers like a small blue flag of fragility. And when the officer finally turned to Daniel, expecting defense, Daniel instead handed over the passes and said, "Scan them," in front of everyone. There was something about the sentence that slowed the room. The officer scanned the first pass, green, the second, green, the third. Green again. A visible ripple moved through the front cabin, the kind that comes when public certainty has to reverse itself too quickly to feel graceful, and Brent's jaw tightened. But rather than apologize, he pivoted again, saying, "Then there may be a fare class fraud issue or a manual override," reaching for new suspicion the way drowning men reach for drifting wood. And the older woman in 2A let out one cold laugh that contained no amusement at all, while Lena lowered her gaze because shame can spread to witnesses too, especially when they knew the truth earlier and said too little. Yet Daniel still refused anger, and that refusal made Brent look smaller each second. Because cruelty expects resistance it can punish, not dignity it cannot stain. While the camera from the young passenger kept rolling, now close enough to catch every face, every swallow, every cowardly glance away. Then came the call Daniel had missed twice already, and in the strange silence after the final green scan, his phone lit up again against his palm, the same private number, and for the first time he answered, not stepping aside, not lowering his voice enough for Brent's comfort, only saying, "Daniel speaking," while the airport seemed to continue moving elsewhere in a different universe. Baggage carts outside the window, boarding music overhead, ice clinking in glasses. Nobody was drinking anymore, and the voice on the other end was warm, urgent, unmistakably affluent, the kind of controlled excitement that belongs to rooms where billions move on signatures. "Daniel, I need your authorization on one final travel allocation adjustment. Also, congratulations, press release goes live at noon. You are now the majority cash holder, and yes, before you ask, the discretionary account is active." And Daniel closed his eyes just once. Not from pleasure, but from timing so absurd it almost felt cruel, while his wife looked at him and understood from his face that the world had shifted under their feet again. Brent, who could hear only fragments, crossed his arms and performed boredom. But the older woman in 2A noticed the difference immediately, the respect in the voice on the phone, the way Daniel spoke back in precise numbers, not confused questions, and after a brief exchange he said quietly, "Can the account execute direct passenger inventory purchase through the airline partner portal?" Which was such a strange, specific sentence in that setting that even the officers glanced at one another. And when the reply came, Daniel listened, nodded once, and answered, "Good, hold for instruction," then lowered the phone without any dramatic flourish, only asking Brent, "How many unsold first-class seats are left on this flight and the next one?" And Brent actually smiled at that, mistaking calm for bluff, the way insecure people always do when reality arrives dressed too simply for their liking. No. One laughed when Daniel made the second call. Maybe it was the sudden stillness in his voice, or maybe it was because everyone had already watched 3 accusations collapse in public. but when he stepped slightly aside with the phone to his ear and spoke to someone named Mara from a travel desk that clearly did not operate in ordinary customer language, the atmosphere changed from spectacle to suspense. He asked for immediate purchase of every unsold first-class seat on the current flight, then the next available departure to the same destination, then companion upgrade rights attached to his new corporate travel agreement. His tone so matter-of-fact that it made the numbers sound ordinary even though they weren't, while Brent's smile slowly faded by degrees too small for him to control. And Lena felt her pulse beat in her throat as she realized this man wasn't inventing leverage, he was deploying it with the restraint of someone who understood exactly how much of it he possessed. The woman recording moved closer, no longer hiding the phone at all, and whispered to her live stream, "Guys, I think this man is buying the whole first-class cabin." While comments exploded across her screen faster than she could read them, strangers online reacting to a moment nobody at the gate had fully understood yet. And then Daniel said one more thing into the phone that turned the room inside out. "After purchase, transfer 4 seats back to the airline for operational flexibility, but leave the rest in my name. I'll decide the passenger list." He ended the call and slid the phone into his jacket like a man putting away a receipt. Not a weapon, and for several seconds nobody spoke because the sentence itself needed time to be believed. Then Brent laughed once too late, too thin, and said, "Sir, you can't just buy," before his own handheld device vibrated in his palm and the color in his face changed. The notification on Brent's device came with the soft chirp of routine software. But in that front cabin it sounded like judgment, and he looked down expecting support from the system that had already protected him all morning, only to find seat inventory reissued. Cabin status altered, premium hold released. Ownership flags attached to a private travel contract through one of the airline's corporate alliance partners. More technical language than anyone nearby could follow, but enough for Brent to understand one unbearable fact. Daniel had done exactly what he said he would do. His hand lowered a fraction, shoulders stiffening, and across the aisle the older woman in 2A asked sweetly, "Still protecting the integrity of the cabin?" Not loudly, not cruelly, but with precision sharp enough to split pride down the middle. While the officers at the door took one step back from the family without being told to, sensing the moral terrain had shifted under their boots, and Lena, who had spent years watching class operate like invisible gravity in airports, felt something almost painful break open in her chest, because the truth had not changed when money appeared, only the room's willingness to recognize it. Daniel turned to his children first, not the crowd, and said, "You're fine. You did nothing wrong." Then to his wife, "Take the seats." She looked at him with 100 unspoken memories in her eyes-rent notices. Night shifts, the time they sold their second car, the months when their son thought ramen was a treat because he did not know it was what they could afford, and nodded once, not because she was dazzled, but because this moment was bigger than comfort now. It was about what happens when dignity survives long enough to meet power. Brent opened his mouth twice before words came out, each attempt sounding less like authority and more like air escaping a punctured mask, while from several rows-back passengers began murmuring questions, asking whether the family could actually choose who sat in first class, and Daniel answered, "Yes," with such unadorned certainty that the whole cabin seemed to lean toward him. He could have kept every seat, empty out of pure retaliation. And maybe that is what Brent expected, because cruel people often believe power exists only to mirror their own impulses. But Daniel looked down the aisle toward the gate door where economy passengers were still backed up and said, "Bring me the standby list, the medical pre-boards, the military family if they're still waiting, and anyone traveling for emergency reasons," and that one sentence did more to expose Brent than any insult ever could. Because in the exact space where Brent had used first class as a wall to shame a tired family, Daniel used it as a room to make other people breathe easier. Lena rushed to the gate agent, pulling manifests, cross-checking notes, suddenly moving with the kind of purpose that comes when conscience finally outruns fear. While the woman recording had tears in her eyes now, Not from spectacle, but from the little things: a father smoothing his son's hair after public embarrassment, the mother kneeling to help her daughter with the seatbelt, the older woman into a shifting her designer tote to make room for a soldier's pregnant wife who had been upgraded 2 rows ahead. And as the selected passengers entered the cabin, each one carrying a different kind of invisible exhaustion, Daniel greeted them not like a benefactor showing off generosity, but like someone who had once needed grace and remembered the price of receiving it, which triggered another quick flashback: a winter night in the storage unit office, space heater broken, invoices unpaid. Daniel asleep over spreadsheets while his wife draped her own coat over his shoulders and said, "If we ever have enough, promise me one thing: we don't become the kind of people who enjoy seeing others small." And back then he had smiled because the idea of ever having enough felt almost fictional, but the promise had stayed. Now, in this gold-lit cabin smelling of leather and brewed coffee, it returned in full, and every person Brent had silently ranked all morning became a witness to what real status looked like when it finally entered the room. The consequences began before the aircraft even pushed back, because public humiliation travels fast when someone catches it cleanly on camera, and the young woman's video Brent blocking the family, the green boarding scans, Daniel's son asking if they had done something wrong. The sudden quiet after the purchase alert had already crossed from live stream to repost to newsroom inbox in under 20 minutes, while corporate escalations lit up internal airline channels like a runway at night. Supervisors calling supervisors, legal messaging station management, PR drafting statements before the plane had even closed its door. A regional operations director boarded personally, face tight, tie slightly crooked from the rush, and asked to speak with Daniel in private, but Daniel declined private conversation with the same calm he had used all day, saying, "You can speak here, because when harm is public, apology hidden in corners is often just reputation management wearing regret." And so there, in front of passengers, crew, the officers, and the children who had absorbed every second of the insult, the director apologized for the mistreatment, the false accusations, the misuse of security escalation, and the failure of staff to intervene sooner. His voice careful, corporate, but not empty. He then turned to Brent and asked for his ID badge. The cabin went so still you could hear a spoon settle in a cup. Brent's fingers trembled only once as he unclipped it, but everyone saw it. Lena looked away out of mercy. The older woman did not. Daniel accepted the apology without gloating, simply saying, "My children heard what was said to them. Make sure that matters as much as the seats." It was the hardest sentence in the room, because no settlement can fully return a child's first lesson about class in public. The director nodded like a man who had just been told the truth, in the simplest language possible, and would spend a long time thinking about it. Once the aircraft finally left the gate and lifted into a sky gone soft with afternoon haze, the emotional aftermath settled more deeply than the incident itself, because adrenaline leaves and memory stays, and in the quieter rhythm of flight, Daniel's daughter fell asleep with her rabbit tucked beneath her chin while his son stared out the window too long, pretending clouds were more interesting than feelings, until Daniel leaned over and said, "Ask it," and the boy, after a pause so small it almost broke, whispered, "Why did he think we didn't belong here?" The question was not really about an airplane. Daniel knew that. He looked at the reflection of his own face in the window for a moment before answering, because some people decide who belongs by what they can see fast: clothes, bags, accent, tired faces. They call it instinct when it's really laziness. The boy absorbed that in silence. Then Daniel added, "But where you belong is not decided by the smallest person in the room." Across the aisle, the older woman, who had introduced herself as Eleanor but had long since become something gentler than a stranger, pretended to read while listening with wet eyes, and a few rows ahead the pregnant military wife wiped hers openly. Because there are moments on planes when the usual boundaries between strangers disappear and everyone becomes temporary family around one shared wound. Meanwhile, Lena, now reassigned to cabin service for the flight because management needed hands and witnesses close, moved carefully through the aisle with an apology living in her throat. She was not yet sure she had earned the right to speak. Until eventually she stopped beside Daniel's row and said quietly, "I should have stepped in sooner." Daniel looked up, saw the truth on her face, and answered, "You did step in, just later than you wanted." It was not full absolution, but it was enough to make her eyes burn. And for the rest of the flight she served every passenger with a tenderness that came not from training but from shame, transformed into choice, halfway through the flight. As golden evening light stretched long across tray tables and the cabin settled into that suspended hush unique to the hours between conflict and landing, Daniel finally told his wife the full truth about the acquisition, speaking softly while their children slept. And she covered her mouth first, not from greed or disbelief, but from the sudden release of years she had held together with grit. Because the sale meant more than wealth. It meant no more deciding between medication and rent in bad months, no more pretending not to notice shoes worn thin at the toes, no more carrying brilliance in a lunch pail and hoping the world would eventually stop mistaking it for failure. Another flashback came and went like distant weather. Daniel in the storage unit, first client lost, account overdrawn, sitting on an upside-down crate with his head in his hands while his wife placed a paper cup of diner coffee beside him and said, "You are not behind. You are being built," and he had wanted to believe her so badly it hurt. Now, years later, 30,000 feet above the clouds, he reached for her hand and held it with the same gratitude he had felt in that freezing room, while around them the first-class cabin looked different than it had at boarding, not because the seats had changed, but because the people inside them had redefined the meaning of privilege for one afternoon. The woman recording had long since stopped streaming and now sat quietly editing clips, with captions she kept deleting because none of them felt adequate. Eleanor sipped tea and watched the children with the solemn affection of someone remembering old wounds. Lena folded blankets with unusual care. Even the businessmen who had once smirked had grown subdued, confronted by the embarrassment of how quickly they had sided with humiliation before evidence. And somewhere far below, on the ground, Brent's day was still getting worse. By the time the plane landed, the story had outrun the aircraft. Phones lit up before the wheels fully stopped. Messages pouring in from reporters, bloggers, corporate contacts, and strangers who had seen fragments of the video and filled in the emotional truth even before formal details were confirmed. At the gate, airline executives waited in press suits and practiced expressions. But the moment Daniel stepped into the aisle with his daughter on one hip and duffel bag over his shoulder, the cabin broke into applause, not the loud, thoughtless kind people give to routine landings, but the slower, fuller kind that rises from gratitude, shame, and admiration all at once. And Daniel visibly disliked the attention, which somehow made the moment more powerful, because he was not there to perform victory. He was there to get his family home. Still, he paused long enough at the aircraft door to thank Lena by name, to shake hands with the officers who had later apologized for assuming before verifying, and to tell Eleanor, "You spoke up when it cost social comfort. That matters." She smiled sadly and answered, "At my age, comfort is overrated." Then came the formal part outside the door, a written apology. Full refund offers he did not need, compensation packages. Mileage bonuses absurdly small compared to what had happened. Notification that Brent had been removed pending investigation for discriminatory conduct and misuse of security protocol, and a request from airline legal to discuss restitution. Daniel listened, then said the sentence that would become the second most quoted line after his son's question. "Don't restore my trust with points. Restore it with policy, training, and consequences that protect the next family before they need money to be believed." Cameras from local media were already gathering near the concourse entrance. The woman who had recorded the incident stood back and lowered her phone for the first time all day, understanding instinctively that some endings deserve witness, not intrusion. And Daniel walked through that terminal exactly as he had entered it, quietly, carrying more than he displayed. With his family around him and dignity intact, later that night after statements were issued, After headlines called it unbelievable and viral feeds debated class, prejudice, and public shame, after Brent's badge was deactivated and internal reviews began that would likely end his airline career before the week was over, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the same old scratched watch beside a cup of reheated coffee and listened to his children, sleeping down the hall in their own beds again. The house still humble, still familiar, still carrying the shape of the years that had formed them. And he thought about how close humiliation always lives to power in this world, how often dignity is tested long before it is vindicated. How many people are judged at first glance by uniforms of wealth they do not wear. How many good workers stay silent 1 minute too long because systems teach them the price of contradicting the wrong person. And yet how one voice, one witness, one act of moral courage can tilt an entire room back toward truth. He thought of Lena stepping forward, Eleanor refusing politeness over justice, the young woman who recorded instead of looking away, his son asking the hardest question in the world, his wife reminding him years ago not to become the kind of person who enjoyed making others feel small, and he understood something success had not given him but had revealed. Quiet power is not the ability to dominate a room, it is the strength to stay human when the room gives you every excuse not to. So if this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated, publicly judged, or treated like you didn't belong until money, status, or someone else's approval made people listen, leave your thoughts below because EchoStory was built for moments exactly like this. And if you believe dignity should never depend on appearance, class, or who speaks the loudest, then subscribe, share this story. And remember, some people buy first-class seats to feel above others. And some people buy them to prove no child should ever have to earn basic respect in the first place.